At a federal courthouse, an old, weary-looking man shuffled through the front doors, unnoticed by most. But to the security team, he was more than invisible. He was a problem. They didn't just question him. They humiliated him. They dragged him into a back room, shaved his head without consent, and laughed, each cruel swipe stripping away his dignity. What they didn't realize was that the man they mocked held more power than they could ever imagine. And his silence wasn't weakness. It was the calm before the storm. Before we dive deeper into this unforgettable story, let us know where you're watching from. We would love to hear your thoughts. On a crisp autumn morning in downtown Denver, Colorado, the city stirred awake under a heavy gray sky. Sylvester Stallone walked slowly towards the courthouse steps. His transformation was complete. Stooped posture, a battered wool coat fraying at the seams, cracked boots scuffing against the stone. Under a sagging knit cap, a grizzled beard and carefully applied makeup rendered him nearly unrecognizable. To any passerby, he was just another forgotten man in a city that had learned too well how to look past the broken and the poor. Inside his coat pocket, tucked carefully between worn gloves, was a legitimate summons to attend a hearing on prison reform, issued under his full legal name, Michael Sylvester Gardenzio Stallone. Today wasn't about speeches or cameras. It was about understanding firsthand what it felt like to be dismissed before you even spoke. As he approached the metal detectors, Stallone could feel the subtle shift in energy. Court officers sipping coffee and chatting casually straightened, their eyes narrowing with immediate suspicion. Deputy Shane Collar, a thick-set man with a hard jaw and a harder heart, stepped directly into Stallone's path, his tone barking and sharp. "Hold up, old man," Shane said, the authority in his voice mixed with disdain. "Where you think you're going?" Stallone answered quietly, his voice low and rough. "Got a hearing notice." He moved to produce the document, but Shane snatched it without reading, his nose wrinkling as if the very presence of Stallone was an offense. "Smells like the bus station in here," he muttered, loud enough for others to hear. A few snickers broke from the other guards. Stallone stood his ground, saying nothing as Shane scrutinized him like an insect. "Random screening," Shane barked. "Step this way." Two more deputies flanked Stallone, guiding him down a side corridor lined with buzzing vending machines and faded posters about jury duty. The hallway smelled like bleach and stale coffee. They pushed into a small, windowless security room where the air seemed thinner. Stallone stood silently as Shane rummaged through a drawer, producing a buzzing set of electric clippers with a cruel glint in his eyes. "Can't have you hiding contraband under that mop," Shane said, stepping closer with a smirk. Stallone didn't resist as they forced him into a folding chair. The clippers roared to life, and with no warning, Shane pressed them to Stallone's scalp. Coarse gray strands fell to the tile floor in clumps. Stallone shut his eyes briefly, breathing deeply through his nose. He didn't flinch. He didn't protest. He bore the humiliation quietly, each buzz of the clippers cutting deeper into his dignity, stripping away not just the disguise but a shared history of millions who had been treated like less than human for how they looked. When Shane finished, he patted Stallone's bare scalp with mock affection and dropped the clippers back onto the table. "There. Now you almost look respectable," he sneered. Stallone stood, brushed loose hairs from his coat, reclaimed the crumpled summons from a table without asking, and stepped back into the hall without a word. His bare scalp tingled against the chill draft in the corridor. He made his way back to the lobby, the buzz of conversation low and indifferent. Lawyers in tailored suits passed him by without a second glance, badges swinging from their lapels. Nobody recognized him. Nobody cared. He slid into the back of courtroom 4B, where preparations were underway for a high-profile hearing on civil rights violations in Colorado's prison system. It was a hearing that had already drawn the attention of local news and national advocacy groups. As Stallone waited silently, the courtroom filled slowly with attorneys adjusting their files, reporters murmuring into phones, and nervous plaintiffs whispering to each other. Shane Collar posted himself stiffly near the entrance, arms crossed, scanning the room with the hollow confidence of someone who believed they were untouchable. Then the double doors swung open with a hush of shifting air. Every head turned as Sylvester Stallone entered, this time without disguise. The courtroom stilled. Gone was the stooped old man. In his place stood the iconic figure known to millions, wearing a sharp navy suit, polished shoes gleaming against the marble floor, and his freshly shaven scalp catching the overhead lights. Stallone's face was calm, composed, the face of a man who had seen both the ugly and the beautiful sides of humanity and refused to be broken by either. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Cameras clicked discreetly. Shane Collar's face drained of color, the bravado seeping out of his stance as he recognized the man he had degraded only an hour earlier. His mouth worked wordlessly. The security badge pinned to his chest now seemed to weigh heavily on him, dragging him down. Sylvester walked slowly, deliberately down the center aisle, his steps echoing sharply in the silent room. He stopped before the bench where the Honorable Judge Edith McLaren, a woman known throughout Colorado for her steady hand and fierce devotion to fairness, sat overseeing the morning's docket. She removed her reading glasses slowly, studying him with cautious curiosity. "Mr. Stallone," she said, her voice even but edged with concern, "this is quite unexpected." Stallone nodded once, his voice resonant as he spoke. "Your Honor, I wish to address the court. This morning, upon attempting to enter this building under the lawfully issued summons you now hold, I was detained without cause, subjected to physical humiliation, and stripped of my dignity by those charged to protect this very institution." A gasp rippled through the observers. Judge McLaren's gaze sharpened as she shifted her attention toward the security officers lining the walls. Stallone continued, "Despite presenting legal identification and credentials, I was treated not as a citizen, but as a threat, because of how I appeared, not because of who I am." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the room like a stone dropped into a still lake. "If this can happen to someone like me, standing here in full view of the public eye, imagine what happens to those who have no fame, no fortune, no voice." The judge's face tightened into a grim line. She turned her eyes toward Shane Collar, who stood paralyzed, sweat forming at his temples. His hands, once casually resting on his duty belt, now gripped it tightly, as if it could anchor him against the inevitable tide rising around him. Stallone didn't need to say more. His presence, his shaved scalp, and the righteous fury carefully contained behind his calm demeanor spoke louder than any testimony. Judge McLaren leaned back in her chair, her voice cutting cleanly through the heavy air. "Deputy Collar," she said, each syllable a blow, "you are hereby relieved of your duties, pending full federal investigation into allegations of civil rights violations and abuse of authority." The courtroom exhaled collectively, a silent acknowledgement that something important had just happened. Shane didn't move. 2 U.S. Marshals approached him without ceremony, one placing a firm hand on his shoulder. His eyes darted helplessly to Stallone, but the actor did not so much as blink. And so, as the morning sun crept higher over the Denver skyline, a man who had built his legend on the big screen quietly but indelibly reclaimed justice for the countless unseen. And in that solemn old courthouse, something shifted, not just for that day, but for everyone who would ever walk through those doors again. As Shane Collar was quietly escorted out of the courtroom by the marshals, the weight of what had just transpired settled into the bones of everyone present. No one clapped, no one cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was heavier, more solemn, as if justice itself had paused to take a long, measured breath. Sylvester Stallone remained standing in the center aisle for a moment longer, his presence filling the room, not with celebrity glamour, but with something far more powerful: integrity. Judge McLaren tapped her gavel lightly, bringing the room's attention back. Her voice was calm but edged with steel. This court will recess for 15 minutes. Upon return, we will discuss how to proceed with a formal inquiry into the events described. She nodded once towards Stallone, a silent acknowledgement between two people who understood that dignity was not given. It was asserted, often at a cost. Outside in the hallway, the buzz of reporters ramped up instantly. Phones pressed to ears, cameras lifted, microphones shoved forward. Stallone, never one to seek spectacle for its own sake, raised a hand briefly to signal that he would not be making a statement. At least, not yet. He needed time to think, to feel. It wasn't anger roiling inside him. It was something more complicated, something sadder, a deep disappointment in how easy it had been for a uniform and a badge to strip a man of his humanity. He found a quiet alcove near the vending machines, away from the flashing bulbs and shouted questions, and leaned against the cool marble wall. From there, he watched unnoticed as court employees hurried past, some whispering, some casting furtive glances in his direction. Even among those who hadn't been directly involved, there was a sense of shame hanging thick in the air. The heavy realization that injustice hadn't just arrived that morning. It had always been there, just easier to ignore until it wore a famous face. Meanwhile, upstairs in a conference room, Judge McLaren met with the chief clerk and 2 senior marshals. The decision was made quickly and unanimously. An emergency motion would be filed with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, requesting an independent investigation into the conduct not only of Deputy Collar, but of the broader courthouse security practices. By the time the courtroom reconvened, the wheels of formal accountability had already begun turning. As people filtered back into their seats, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. The conversations were quieter. The laughter that had once peppered the courthouse halls was absent. Even the defense attorneys, often so smug and self-assured, now shuffled their papers with an awkward stiffness. Judge McLaren called the session back to order and motioned for Stallone to step forward again. "Mr. Stallone," she said, "I understand you did not come here today expecting to participate in any official capacity. Nevertheless, the court would like to invite you to make a brief statement for the record, should you wish." Stallone nodded once and stepped up to the podium. He placed both hands on the sides of the wooden stand, not gripping it for support, but grounding himself, the way a fighter does before the first bell. His voice, when he spoke, was steady but carried the gravelly depth of a man who had lived 1,000 lives, some on film, but many more carved into the private landscape of his own history. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," he began, his words plain, almost conversational. "I came here because I care about justice, about the people who don't have the luxury of fame or cameras to back them up, about the men and women who walk into places like this every day and get treated like they're less than nothing just because they don't look right, or dress right, or speak with the kind of polish the world expects." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room, connecting with people, grounding his story in the real faces before him. "This morning, before I said a word, before I even showed a piece of ID, I was judged, mistreated, and humiliated based on nothing more than appearance. And if it can happen to me, you know it's happening every single day to people who don't have a way to fight back." The courtroom was utterly silent. You could hear the soft mechanical whir of the old ceiling fans overhead, the quiet click of a reporter's laptop keys. Stallone leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough that people unconsciously leaned forward to catch every word. "Justice isn't a building," he said. "It isn't a badge. It isn't a robe. It's how we treat the people who have no power. It's what we do when nobody's looking. Or, better yet, what we do when everybody is." He stepped back from the podium. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Judge McLaren, her voice thicker now, perhaps with emotion she wouldn't dare show fully, simply said, "Thank you, Mr. Stallone. Your words will be entered into the record." She tapped her gavel once more, declaring a recess for the day, and the people rose, not because the bailiff barked an order, but because they felt, somewhere deep in their bones, that it was the right thing to do. As Stallone exited the courtroom, flanked loosely by a swarm of press, a woman in her late 60s, wearing a faded Denver Broncos jacket, pressed a hand gently against his arm. She didn't say anything at first. Her eyes, watery and earnest, searched his face. Then she simply whispered, "Thank you, for all of us." Stallone nodded, his own throat tightening in response. No speech could capture what passed between them in that moment, just the simple, raw acknowledgement of dignity restored. In the days that followed, the story exploded across the country. News networks replayed grainy security footage of the altercation. Social media was flooded with outrage and support, and civil rights organizations seized the moment to renew calls for sweeping reform in courthouse security procedures nationwide. Commentators debated the symbolism of the shaved head, likening it to the ways in which marginalized people throughout history had been stripped, both literally and figuratively, of their identity and humanity. But beyond the headlines and the hashtags, a quieter revolution began taking root. Judge McLaren, leveraging the attention, pushed through a comprehensive review of all courthouse security practices across Colorado's federal courts. Mandatory anti-bias training was instituted. Anonymous reporting channels were opened. Every complaint, previously dismissed without investigation, was ordered to be reopened and reviewed by an independent counsel. Stallone, for his part, refused every interview request that tried to sensationalize what had happened. He did agree, however, to sit down for a recorded town hall discussion in the very same courthouse where everything had unfolded. That afternoon, in the courthouse's packed main chamber, Stallone sat on a plain wooden chair under the watchful gaze of a community newly awakened. There were no bright lights, no makeup artists, no handlers, just Sylvester Stallone, bareheaded, scarred by experience, and utterly unbowed. He listened as others spoke first. A young black man detailing how he had been frisked aggressively every time he came for jury duty. An elderly Hispanic woman explaining how she had been mocked for her accent when asking for directions. A former veteran recounting how he had been shoved out of line and told he looked like a troublemaker. Each story was different, yet each was painfully familiar. When it was finally Stallone's turn, he didn't give a speech. He simply said, "The way we fix this is simple, but not easy. We listen, we change, we remember." Then he stood, nodded once to the crowd, and walked out, not as Rocky Balboa, not as John Rambo, but as Sylvester Stallone, an American citizen who had used his platform to hold a mirror up to a system long overdue for reflection. Outside, the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds at last, casting long golden beams across the courthouse steps. And for the first time in a long while, those steps didn't just lead to a place of law. They led to something closer to justice. In the weeks following the town hall, something subtle but undeniable shifted in Denver. It wasn't marked by grand parades or sweeping declarations. It lived instead in the small, almost imperceptible ways people moved and spoke within the old federal courthouse. Officers at the security stations now looked visitors in the eye when they spoke to them. Clerks and bailiffs offered assistance with a tone that was warmer, less perfunctory. The courthouse, once a building where fear and dismissal clung to the walls like old wallpaper, began to feel a little more human again. News crews eventually packed up and moved on to the next story, as they always do. But the seed had been planted too deep, this time, to be forgotten. Lawsuits were filed and reforms were implemented, not just in Denver, but in federal courthouses across the nation, as ripples of Stallone's quiet stand traveled far beyond Colorado's borders. Inside the courthouse, a new plaque was installed near the entrance. It was simple, understated, equal dignity for all. It didn't bear Stallone's name, at his own insistence. He had told Judge McLaren privately, "This isn't about me. It's about making sure the next person who walks through those doors isn't judged before they even speak." His words stayed with her long after the cameras were gone. Judge McLaren, a woman known for her stoic professionalism, found herself changed as well. She led the establishment of the Citizens Review Panel, a rotating board of community members tasked with anonymously reviewing courthouse complaints. For the first time, the system was forced to look at itself with honest eyes. And perhaps most importantly, a slow but steady wave of training programs, mentorship opportunities, and awareness campaigns began to bloom, not driven by fear of scandal, but by a shared, hard-won understanding that justice, to be worthy of its name, had to start with decency. As for Stallone, he returned to Los Angeles, but he didn't retreat into comfort or celebrity. He often found himself reflecting late at night, staring out over the lights of the city, thinking about the man he had been asked to become that day in Denver, the vulnerable, worn figure who had been so easy to dismiss. He realized that while he could shed the disguise, millions of others never could. Their reality wasn't a role they could step out of. It stayed with him in ways he hadn't expected. He quietly funded a series of scholarships for law students committed to civil rights work. He sat in on meetings with advocacy groups, not as a figurehead, but as a listener. And he wrote, not a memoir of fame and fortune, but a series of essays reflecting on dignity, justice, and the unseen battles fought every day in places like courthouse lobbies, waiting rooms, and quiet side streets. 1 year to the day after the incident, Stallone returned to Denver, this time without fanfare. There were no reporters at the airport, no photographers trailing him through the streets. He walked into the courthouse dressed in simple jeans and a denim jacket, his now graying hair cut close to his head, his eyes the same steady brown that had once looked down opponents in the ring, but now carried a deeper, quieter fire. He passed through security without issue. The guards nodded respectfully, treating him like any other citizen, which was exactly what he wanted. Inside, a small ceremony was underway. Not for him, but for the first graduating class of the Courthouse Community Outreach Program, a new initiative aimed at building bridges between the legal system and the people it served. High school students, retired veterans, former defendants who had turned their lives around, all stood proudly as certificates were handed out and hands were shaken. Judge McLaren spotted Stallone standing quietly in the back and made her way through the crowd. She shook his hand warmly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "You started something here," she said. Stallone shook his head. "We started it," he corrected, and she smiled in agreement. After the ceremony, Stallone sat in one of the worn wooden benches lining the main hall and watched as families, students, and community members filled the once intimidating space with laughter and easy conversation. He thought about how much could change in a year when people decided to stop accepting the unacceptable. As he sat there, a young man approached him, a teenager with nervous energy and wide, earnest eyes. "Mr. Stallone?" the boy asked, voice cracking slightly. "Yeah, that's me," Stallone said with a small smile. The boy shifted awkwardly, then blurted out, "I just wanted to say, I saw the video last year, what they did to you. My dad said stuff like that used to happen to him all the time, but nobody ever believed him." Stallone nodded slowly, letting the boy find his words. "But seeing you go through it, and seeing you stand up, it made me realize that it's not just normal. It's not right. It made me want to be a lawyer, to fight for people like my dad." Stallone reached out and clapped the boy gently on the shoulder. "That's the real fight," he said, "making sure that the people who come after us don't have to fight the same battles." Later, as the sun dipped behind the Rocky Mountains and the courthouse emptied once again into the cool Denver evening, Stallone lingered on the steps. He looked up at the plaque near the door, simple, sturdy, and true, and felt a rare, profound sense of peace. Not the kind that comes from winning an award or topping a box office chart, but the kind that roots itself deep in your soul when you know you've done something that matters, when you know you've helped move the world, even just a little, in the right direction. As he turned to leave, he passed by a young woman hurrying toward the courthouse, her arms full of legal pads and binders. She barely noticed him, but offered a quick, polite smile. Stallone returned it with a nod, unseen and ordinary, exactly as it should be. Behind him, the courthouse doors swung closed with a soft, solemn thud. But inside those walls, and inside the hearts of those who had been there, the echoes of that single act of dignity and courage would never really fade. They would live on, growing quietly in the spaces where silence once ruled, until one day, perhaps, they would not need to be spoken of at all. Because dignity, once demanded and defended, has a way of remaking the world one quiet, stubborn step at a time. As Sylvester Stallone walked away under the broad, open Colorado sky, his steps were slow but steady, his heart a little lighter, and his belief in the quiet, stubborn goodness of ordinary people stronger than ever. For all his years playing heroes on the silver screen, he knew now, more than ever, that the real heroes were the ones who stood up, not in the spotlight, not with fanfare, but in the quiet, hard, necessary moments when doing so made all the difference. And somewhere, deep down, he knew this wasn't the end of the fight. It was only the beginning.